welcome Senator Liz Lovelett of the 40th District. My first question is, share a little bit of background regarding being a community leader and how you were drawn into the political leadership role. And second, what type of projects have you worked on regarding vulnerable populations? Because I read in your bio, affordable housing.
Absolutely. So I kind of got started out in a weird way. I own a record store in town, The Business. If anybody's ever been in Anacortes, it's been around since 1978. So I was the third owner on that. And during that period of time, I ended up using my storefront as an opportunity to do some political organizing, screening films, finding out different ways to get actively involved in the community, so that when an ask came from a friend in 2013 to see if I might be interested in running for city council, I'd already put in a couple of times as a PTA president and got involved with my farmers market. And then with my small business background, just hit the streets. And I took out a 2-term incumbent my first run to take on my role at the city council. And immediately my kind of calling there was, one, really staring at the face of having a refinery in our area, and what did that look over time. Since we had oil trains coming, we had one refinery that had oil trains and one that didn't. It was in a permitting process. Had an opportunity to really dig in on our comprehensive plan update. So that's like every element in the city that you have to plan for has to have an element in your comprehensive plan. So transportation, housing, but we did not have one for water. So worked really heavily on getting the water and utility planning element together. And then about 2 years, I would say, in really just identified that just like everywhere in the US right now, we're really struggling with housing shortage for working people. Mm-hmm. And so what did that look like and in our area, we have a huge gap for seniors. They're maybe getting to a point where they can't take care of a whole house and they want to downsize, but where do they go? How do they find things that are affordable? So started a council committee that we didn't have before that was about housing affordability and community resources, and then worked towards authoring their strategic plan. So now we have an affordable housing strategic plan in Anacortes that they've been kind of using as a template for other jurisdictions in our area. So from there, I actually started attending Western. I got accepted to Western and started attending at Fairhaven, and was so excited to go back. I did Running Start, so I graduated in '98 with my associate's degree, and then after doing a couple years of national service, getting married, having babies, having a record store, etc., finally decided I was ready to go back, and I was in my first quarter back at Western, and then the appointment to the Senate came up, and I went out for it and ended up, against all odds and again against a very entrenched incumbent, ended up getting that appointment. So last year I ran to retain my seat. This year I have to run again for a full term. So that's just kind of the landscape there. But in the Senate, I came in with a group. My cohort is the youngest, queerest, most people of color group that's ever come into the Senate before. We pretty much changed the Senate is always the oldest white guys, like generally speaking, in any Senate anywhere in the land. Gets worse the higher up you go. At any rate, so to have so many like young women, people of color, like it just completely changed the landscape of like the kinds of things that we really wanted to focus on, and changed the landscape of what kind of bills that I think had previously been introduced that didn't have enough votes now had enough votes. So things like criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform, really linking what happens to vulnerable communities that have traditionally been left out of decision-making processes, like people who live right next to a factory, those kinds of environmental justice and equity considerations, making sure that transgender folks have access to healthcare, making sure that our immigrant population has access to healthcare. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we now have the opportunity to put some attention and focus to in the Senate in a way that wasn't there before. And keeping in mind that the House of Representatives generally is a lot more progressive, right? They turn over more quickly. There's a lot more of them. They've had a majority of women in their leadership for quite a while. So they often had things that came out of the House that was like really incredible pieces of legislation that just went to die in the Senate. So for me, what I'm looking towards, in addition to kind of my general passion and sensitivity to women's issues, LGBTQ issues, immigration and undocumented folks issues, environmental justice, and all of that acumen that I normally, access to childcare, things that I'm normally very passionate about. The main focus of what I'm doing for my interim and moving forward is working on carbon pricing and how we can generally bring about a Green New Deal in the wake of COVID, and realize that we have a whole lot of work to be done in transitioning the way we use energy, the way that we comply with state law as it stands in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, and compliance with the bill that we passed last year, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, that puts us on track by, I think, 2040 to have fully renewable energy. So I'm positioning myself to be the head of basically all of the climate policy in the Senate, and then additionally working on electrifying our ferries. So I've positioned myself to be the leader of the Ferry Legislator Caucus. So I guess I'll give you that as my nutshell introduction, and then I'll answer more questions from there.
How does water management impact our communities, and what type of projects have you been involved in there? And then what are the specific goals moving forward in care regarding water management are based on those needs?
Doesn't get more fundamental than water, I would say. I mean, it's necessary to not only every basic function of human life, cellular development, everything else, but all the way up to kind of there's a lot of very political things that go on around it. So I mentioned earlier having a water feature in our comprehensive plan in Anacortes, and that's because even though we're a fairly small jurisdiction, we have the largest water right in Skagit County. So at 58, I think, million gallons a day uninterruptible water right, we really have a role to control water policy and should be directing that. So at the time, there had been a lot of, and this is continuing to happen, but there had been a lot of effort for private corporate entities to purchase water rights and long-term water leases from municipal and PUD entities in order to, this is the Nestle's of the world, trying to be able to have the right to bottle water and such, which there is a time and a place for bottled water, of course. We need potable water in times of emergency, et cetera. But I think generally speaking, it is a really disastrous public policy to allow private entities to have public water right. So we outright forbade that in our comprehensive plan. And it was interesting because at the time, pretty much I couldn't have had it was like a tin sombrero. It wasn't even like a tin hat. There was no smallness to it. It was like everybody thought I was totally wacky for not wanting to allow corporate ownership. And then it was something like 2 months later, I think they had the big controversy in Walla Walla where Nestle came in and tried to buy up all their water rights. So now it would take a really deep public debate around doing a comprehensive plan update in order to change that. So it's fairly well protected for the near and long term. As far as water, so we have a couple different moving parts here, right? We've got the agricultural needs and wanting to make sure that we still have food resiliency built in the way that we do, our agriculture. There's the fish passage and culverts. And for those of you that don't know, we're currently settling a $3 billion lawsuit with the tribes because we haven't removed enough culverts from our waterways to allow for fish passage. There's the just need for potable water in terms of being able to develop land, and what does rural land development look like moving forward if we're trying to avoid sprawl? How do we make sure that we're forecasting what the water needs are going to be for existing, both residential and commercial customers moving forward? So it really doesn't get more basic than water, and I think that Washington needs to be particularly careful about it because as other places like Arizona, California, Nevada, their water resources start to dry up over time, we're going to need to be really forward thinking about being able to provide those and to not to let our growth outstrip our ability to provide basic utilities. Decision which came out of Whatcom County, which regulated a lot of the river basins throughout the state, but Skagit County was left out of that. So we still have some work to do on figuring out what water basin usage is going to be in the Skagit. And we currently have a situation where we have a whole area of agricultural customers that really have been left with no options but to pirate water. They're just pulling raw water out of the river without any kind of permit or anything because they don't have a utility to turn to in order to get that water. So really needing to look at like not only just the short-term immediate brass tacks of how we get people equitable access to water, but then also how do we continue to build a system that again doesn't outstrip how much growth we can really realistically burden.
Wow, that's incredible. Oil train safety. You mentioned oil trains. Tell us a little bit more about this. There's so many that don't know even regarding the coal trains and other aspects of oil safety. What is important to know and how does it impact our environment? What are the risks?
Well, I think that we've come a really long way from when I first took on oil trains in 2014. That was right after we'd had that really awful explosion that happened in Canada that killed a couple of people and just basically blew a town to smithereens. Now, that was one of those situations where there was a very clear operator error. It has something to do with the way the train guys, how they power down the braking system. If they don't do that correctly, it can make a spark. But that lends itself to the just plain straight up volatility of fracked fuel. There's for all intents and purposes, there's the heavy crudes that come out of like Alaska, the shale oil is like a whole different level of thick crude. But then the sweet stuff, the really light stuff comes out of the fracked fields, and those have a high vapor content. And so there's problems all the way from the point of extraction to the point of refinement. And there's arguments on both sides. You know, for some people, they say, well, there's environmental problems anytime you extract fuel, and we would rather have domestic purview over it by getting it from North Dakota, and rather than having to get it from Saudi Arabia or Nigeria or Venezuela, where there's a little more unstable source and you don't know what kind of regulatory framework is there to protect people on the ground, right? But then you have to move it. So are you going to ship it? Or are you going to put it via pipeline? Or are you going to put it on a train? Well, all three of them have pros and cons, right? Pipelines tend to be safer overall, except for when you have to initially put it in is a huge thing. And then if there are problems, they can be really hard to find until it becomes either an explosion or a massive like spill. Trains, now that they've worked out a lot of the safety and regulatory framework, actually do pretty well. We haven't had hardly any accidents since those first spate of them when the oil trains first came online, and we didn't have the right kind of protocols around like initially when this issue came up, like the people who do the switchboards in local areas, like the train's coming from Montana, it's about to get to Spokane. Those people didn't necessarily know that there was an oil train coming through town. So making sure there was just a certain amount of information being broadcast. Second was things like at-grade crossings and rail bridges, things like that. You know, making sure that those had the right level of safety inspections to make sure that they weren't going to have just a human error caused piece. And then there's a bill that we passed last year had to do with the vapor count that was able to be within the cars. So we reduced the amount of vapor pressure that was allowed to be in the cars to basically reduce their volatility. For coal trains, the environmental issue outside of just coal being really dirty energy is that they run uncovered through huge areas of land. So if you live anywhere adjacent to a rail track that is running coal, you're going to be getting that particulate dust as part of your kind of overall air quality picture.
You live in Anacortes and have a long legacy there of generational. I lived there with my family for 5 years, and it's right there in front of you, that refinery, or it's hard to miss. So I imagine that having a refinery is a constant reminder of that environmental stewardship. And what you're working on.
Absolutely. And realizing, like for me, I have to, being one of the only members of my caucus that's from a rural area, and there's only 2 of us that have a refinery in our district. There's the guys and gals that work in the refinery. There's the management that does the actual facility, and then there's big oil. And for a lot of people, they don't differentiate between those 3 tiers of kind of people that are involved in the business. And for me, it's really important to do that, because my kids go to school with their kids, and I tell you what, they're not trying to blow up the refinery either. They do not want an oil spill either. Like, that is not something that's part of their like, we're wringing our hands together trying to figure out how to fuck the world up. Like, that's just not how it rolls. So keeping in mind that there's like a certain amount of just how we protect workers inside the fence and make sure that they are protected, that they are not, having management decisions that lead to, lowered safety standards that then lead to an explosion, which we have absolutely seen at our refinery here. And many people died.
Yes.
So just realizing that taking care of workers, and this is kind of my general theme with workforce generally, is when you take care of people in their field where they are based on their information of being frontline, it has protections that then have net benefit for the rest of the community and the environment. And I think whether it's nursing or refining or anything else, that is always true. Like, you guys know what creates a safer work space based on your frontline experience of being there. And that to me is the most valuable information for making sure that people are taken care of on the whole.
Yeah, well, and it really is all interconnected, because when that blow up occurred, it was years prior to when I arrived. They were still talking about it in the emergency department. Mm-hmm. There's a legacy burn cart that was donated as a result, and there was still post-trauma in the staff there that had been on the front line. It was devastating.
And my firefighters. So I've worked with my firefighting union since I started, and same thing with them. They remember that, and they have, the way their mutual aid agreements are set up too. It's like they respond in the refinery first, and then they bring in first responders, and then you have the folks at the emergency rooms and stuff that are dealing with it, and everybody up and down the line. It was just horrifying and totally preventable. I mean, they just now published the findings of that investigation like a year ago, and that's informing. They're working with L&I, and I've been an advocate in this process for process safety management. How do you take what is a very preventable thing like that and turn that into meaningful safety protocol that then has the ability to save lives?
That's excellent, Liz. Senator Liz, the nursing students are learning in another class regarding these exact conversations around safety and quality and organizational management. So this really ties in nicely to that piece as well.
Geez, especially in a COVID environment, like, you guys have to protect yourself. You have to protect your patients. You have to protect your families, everybody that you live with. I mean, it's like a constant vigilance. And it's that same thing. It's like, if you guys are being taken care of in your point of contact, then it just makes it that much safer for everybody else that you have to come in contact with. And that just cannot be underscored enough.
Improving lives for the people in your community, that was mentioned in your bio. What does that look like for you?
Oh, it's so many things. A lot of it has to do with the way we figure out our housing situation. Being an environmentalist and trying to figure out the best way to calibrate our land use decisions to have the highest environmental protections possible built into land use means that sometimes it flies in the face of actually getting affordable housing built. So really trying to find that sweet spot between those two things, where we're taking care of the planet, but we're also making sure that there's access to affordable housing. So I've approached it from quite a few different perspectives. One is tasking people that work in like planning and public works to try to find out what are some of the state regulatory frameworks that are burdensome and problematic for actually getting affordable housing built, that have the opportunity to be relooked at and potentially reformed. So there's that piece of it. Another piece is that I've been exploring an Airbnb VRBO surcharge. So this is going to be, just an extra fee that goes on to those short-term rentals, because anytime you have it in the short-term rental market and not in the long-term rental market, that's what keeps our rental rate at like 0.5% around here. And makes it more expensive. So to put a fee on that would go directly to local jurisdictions to be able to build their own affordable housing projects moving forward. I'm also working on how to get on-bill financing for the kinds of quality of life things that will help us achieve our energy goals. So, for example, I'm the second youngest mom in Senate history. I'm also one of the only single moms, just full stop. So I would love to seal all of my ducts and change all of my windows and put in all the fancy appliances and all of that stuff. But no, I don't have the money for that. So how do we create an on-bill financing method where I can have all of those upgrades done, and the energy savings that I'm going to have is going to be basically on point with what I'm currently paying for my utility bills. And I would love to get to a point where we can expand that further to get people into alternative energy schemes, so they're able to get like a PV system on their house or something. Because for me, my power bill is like $40 a month. I am not going to take on a $300 loan every month in order to do that, as much as I would like, because $40 a month is what's comfortable for me and what I can really lean in on. So have been working with, I've gotten a couple different bills that came out last year that helped to start to address that. And then I'm working with our public utility districts and our bigger utilities to see what would it take to get an on-bill financing model available to everybody. Because I think as we look at carbon tax, as we look at a low carbon fuel standard possibility, as we look at all these different kinds of progressive revenue, the impacts almost always fall, especially in Washington State, on people who can least afford to make those changes. And so I'm really sensitive to that. And I want to make sure that particularly seniors, people who are working really hard and still barely making it, like those are the kind of people I want to make sure are protected from, some of the potential unintended consequences of these kinds of policies. So I think that having some kind of on-bill financing way to make sure that utility payments are as low as possible for people as we make this energy transformation is going to be really key. Wow. From this year that touches on a couple of those is I ran a bill to guarantee a WIC benefit, so women and children. I'm sure you guys
that's awesome.
Against that. So it's specifically to have money to spend at the farmers market. So that's a federal program, and having worked with my farmers market to help broaden that, it was really exciting to get that bill out the door, so that that's like a guaranteed benefit that people can have every summer at the farmers market.
What has that taught you about leadership for you as a leader?
Well, the people who need the greatest level of advocacy don't have a lobbyist. That's pretty much the bottom line. So that's where I need to be strong, is that, I was literally applying for food stamps in the weeks leading up to getting appointed to the legislature. This is the first time I've ever, especially as a newly divorced person, been able to pay my own bills and take care of my kids and do all of that. And that voice is largely absent. So that's a huge piece. It's just having been on WIC and having that lived experience of being a part of that program has been a huge piece of what I bring to the table. And then the other thing that I bring is, not many of us have been elected to municipal office. And as a city council member, I really took my job hella seriously. I was on all the committees and did as much work as possible on all those committees to learn about stuff. So it's been really helpful as I've moved into my legislative role, is that, when we talk about a piece of policy that touches on county or local government, I have the ability to come in and be like, well, we're not paying for any of this. How are they supposed to pay for this? What does this mean in terms of enforcement and regulation? And so to be able to bring that lens to things has been incredibly helpful, to just make things a little more practical and useful. So my 3 committee assignments in the Senate are local government. I'm on transportation, and then I'm the vice chair of energy, environment, and technologies. So as I move through this time of creating, kind of different pieces of progressive policy, I found that the interplay between those 3 committees has been really useful for the work I'm trying to get done.
Is vulnerable population and the environment. So just all that you're sharing and educating us on really fits in nicely. So yeah, you are one inspiring and empowering woman. So thank you for being with us.
Hey man, thanks for having me. And I'm so stoked you guys are out doing what you're doing, because that's not my wheelhouse. And so I am so stoked that you guys are out there doing it. And having been a doula too, I've been in some different healthcare settings, and just seeing the day in and day out of that, it's long hours. It's so much heart and compassion. It's so much science and background of expertise. So yeah, go get it.
I have a couple of, I'm just looking here at a couple of questions, and we look at Washington as a sustainable place to live and work. How can we as a community support what you're doing to help achieve that? How can we support your leadership efforts? And how can any one of us become involved?
Okay, I'm going to break that into a few different pieces, some that are a little more locally specific, some that are more regional, and some that are a little more direct. So the thing that is one of the things that I think, if you're talking about healthcare needs in vulnerable populations, it is hard to have a clearer nexus in our area than that of our farm worker community. So as much as we can find ways to continue to expand access to those folks getting quality healthcare, I mean, we're seeing it unfold right now as we're watching them be like ground zero for the biggest COVID outbreaks in the state right now are happening in our food industry. And that is a group that has been in an absolutely obtusely racist way subjugated for decades, 100 years. I mean, just it's awful. And, you know, whether it's having pesticides sprayed on them or whether it's being, you know, asked to work really, really long hours without breaks and meals and water, like there's all kinds of ways that we can be good advocates for them, because the stark reality is our entire agricultural system would completely collapse in the absence of those people being in our community. And so to continue this just narrative around they're taking our jobs or whatever it is just so disingenuous to the way that the system is actually set up. So that's one way to get actively involved in something that has like a direct health outcome for not only those folks individually, but just our food system as a whole. Environmental justice. There are so many different ways that comes to play. I mean, whether it's gig workers that are out there driving Ubers and are barely making any money and don't have any ability to unionize, whether it's, like I said, people who have traditionally lived, neighborhoods that have traditionally been adjacent to factories that don't have emissions control or, you know, next to the airport. Like there's ways to interface and be advocates for that. If you want to be advocates for legislative stuff, though, get an organization together and do a sign-on letter and send it out to my whole caucus, because it's one thing to just reinforce it with the people who are already supportive of it. It's another thing to show advocacy for people who maybe don't necessarily believe in the policy as strongly, and get your sister organizations that are out there in their districts. You know, it's often very apparent who within a particular legislative body is not down with a particular piece of legislation. So exerting pressure and realizing that those kinds of letters matter. And then I would say additionally, one of the things that we, like I have a little special place that I put these because I need them for in case of emergency break glass, but sending nice letters to legislators when they do things that you like is like the best. Because mostly we just get 10,000 calls a week about how awful we are and what big assholes we are and how dare we not ask every single person in the world about every single piece of policy. So when we do something that you like that's really nice. I have a little email file that I just keep for on those rainy days when it's particularly bad. I had some guy call me at my house the other day, super pissed about one piece of legislation, that why I didn't do a community roadshow about. Call me at my house. So, you know, just keeping in mind that it's a weird job. Not everybody wants to do it. So we can use those like atta-girls every once in a while for what we're up to. And then the main thing, though, I would say more than anything is you guys know how it works in your field. If there is a way that state law is flying in the face of providing good, providing you the work environment that you need, or providing your customers the highest level of care. We had a whole lot of interface with our nurses unions around the way that PPEs were being deployed initially once COVID hit. Like these are the kinds of just on the ground insight that is so incredibly helpful for us doing decision making. And so never, ever, ever underestimate your ability to give us meaningful input that we can actually use and create policy that is stronger. My central tenet of lawmaking is trying to bring in the most diverse opinion possible. So like on carbon pricing, I'm starting with all the haters. Like, did you come in and testify con on this? Well, you're the first call on my list. So, you know, like trying to bring in as many different viewpoints so that it's, you know, it's hard to avoid unintended consequences with legislation, because some of it, you know, it takes a couple of years to unroll, and then you find out what the, you know, kinks in the system are and stuff. So at any rate, if there's policy that's affecting you and your guys' ability to deliver care, like those are pieces of feedback that I need.
That's awesome. So everybody, any questions? Because we're wrapping to a close here, because I know that you have another meeting that you're running on to. So
yeah, I was just selected by our leadership team to be on the governor's recovery task force for economic recovery. So
wow,
I'm
congratulations.
It's my first meeting with that group, so I'm like, okay, fake it till I make it. Yeah, I got this. I'll be fine.
You have it. What I've heard already, what I know about you, yes, you have it.
Well, the first recession, I still have my record store, and so I had made the decision to move it from its ancestral home downtown. So I had a baby and I was not quite pregnant with the second one yet, but that was about to be known. So yeah, I hit the first recession running a record store with a baby at the store. And yeah, so it's something I feel very distinctly
yes,
for the small businesses that are out there.
Well, the reality, I believe, is nothing beats that lived experience, right? Like to walk in those shoes yourself, because then you can speak from that place within yourself, in your core, that is integrous.
My field, like a lot of people who came to my field with money, was not my experience. And so I think it's good to be able to stand up and be like, yeah, actually $100 a month is a huge deal. Thank you very much. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What's my day-to-day work experience? You mean as the legislator, or do you mean just like,
yeah, as a legislator?
Yeah, so it's bifurcated into two very distinct segments. There's the during session, and then there's the interim work. So this year was a short session, so it was only 60 days, but I do move to Olympia when that time comes, and then next year it'll be 4 months. So during that period of time, I just miss my kids like crazy, and I see them on the weekends, and yeah. So during session, it's just hella frantic, like meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting all day long, and then committee work. And now that I'm in like a leadership role, and then we have time that's on the floor. So once we've moved through each piece of legislation has to go through a policy committee, and then if necessary, it has to go to a fiscal committee, and then it finally comes to the floor for a vote if we pull it out to actually have it heard on the floor. Then that same bill has to go through and have the exact same process on the House side. So any particular piece of legislation has a long road before it finally gets adopted. And then it's called sine die. Once we gavel out for the year, and then we come home, and each of us has a district office where we do whatever we might want to focus on for the interim, or we do tours and field trips and, all that kind of stuff to just get, all those kind of invitations that we get over the course of the year. But for this year, I really want to have my focus be on, I want to come back in January with a carbon tax that's ready to go. So that'll be the thrust of the work that I'm doing over the interim. And so on an average basis, I do, now that I'm home and we can't go anywhere, I usually do 3 to 5 hours of phone conferences a day. Plus, this is an election year for me, so I have to deal with that as well. And then I have my kids to do their schooling. So I will not be going back to Western this year. My goal is to go back in May of 2021. But right now I just have 6 outstanding credits that I need to finish my papers for, that my Fairhaven instructors were very gracious about being like, yeah, I think you got something else going on right now. We'll just wait for you to come back. So so that's kind of the day in, day out.
I think that there's an honorary degree there for you. All this work.
We'll see. I'd like the real one. I was so stoked. I finally got back to school, and I was like, oh my God, yes, this is what I wanted. I finally felt like I was ready to get into it. I felt like my kids were old enough to deal with my having to go back and forth, and was so excited to be commuting up to Bellingham after years of just, being on my island, which I love. But yeah, I was like, I don't think I've got room or bandwidth or whatever to try to take that on, until I don't have quite so many irons.
Liz.
Yeah.
For your time, Senator Liz. And this is recorded, so the other students in the class will get to hear all of this incredible information.
Yeah, and seriously, any ideas you have for, you'd be amazed at how many bills end up being introduced that were just really good ideas that came from constituents. So it really legitimately does happen. And, paying attention to, if you know who your chair is on a particular, like in the Senate side, it's Senator Annette Cleveland is the head of our healthcare committee, watching out for what kind of bills she's sponsoring or having heard in her committee that might directly, you guys could have a direct role in giving some input on. So thinking about kind of the bills that are in your area of interest and looking them up. I'm not an attorney, obviously, so sometimes I look at those bills and I'm like, who the hell knows what this even says? But that's why we have such great staff at the legislature. They go through all that. When I ask questions, they have answers for me, and that's awesome. So if you have questions, I can also ask those questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
All the best.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all the best to you guys too. Keep in touch.
Yeah.
All
thanks.
right. Thank
Bye.
you.